Breaking down the 2025 running back class. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele, and you can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Last time, I think towards the end of the episode, I can't remember exactly, we talked a little bit about the quarterbacks, talked a little bit about Shedeur Sanders. In particular, I was grilling Shawn a little bit about his profile. Probably we'll talk about the quarterbacks a little bit more another time. We're going to talk about the running backs today. This class, the expectation for the 2025 rookie class, as far as fantasy impact, really revolves around the running back position, and it's exciting. We've alluded to it a little bit. We've talked about it a little bit because the sport itself, we obviously around here on Stealing Bananas like to talk about not just the player profiles, but quite a bit about the league and the way that the sport is being played and how the real football stuff impacts our fantasy football stuff. The sport itself has moved in directions that are really intriguing for running back scoring in fantasy. And in particular, you think about the shifts to the ways the defenses are taking away, explosive pass plays and those things, and they got a lot lighter so they can defend the pass, and the linebackers got to be able to cover, and you don't have those big run stopping linebackers as much anymore. And now with all these lighter defenders, offenses have been able to open up running lanes a little bit more. We've gotten a little bit more efficient running games. We've had some of these teams like the Eagles who are just able to do so much in terms of opening up stuff for Barkley, who then is incredibly talented as well when you get him in open space and is adding to that. And he has a 2,000-yard rushing season and so many other great seasons this year. We've talked about it all off season that 2024 was really a banner year for the running back position. Terms of total yards and all of those things at the top of the position. You can again go back to some of our shows from January right after the season, and in February we were talking through where the league's headed, and now we're going to get this huge influx of talent at the position. There are a bunch of running backs in this class that are really highly regarded, many more than there are at the wide receiver position. Tight end position is viewed favorably as well, but the running back class really is sort of the core. I mean, the quarterback class isn't really viewed super, super favorably either, just talking in broad strokes. But I'm going to get Shawn's take on this stuff because he is the one who knows way more about the specifics than me. I'm talking here in broad strokes, like I said, because I haven't done nearly the amount of research he has done. All of Shawn's write-ups on all of these players you can find in the RotoViz Rookie Guide. I always talk about it. It's awesome. I've read them all. It's hard to keep track of all these running backs. It's one of the cool things. I mean, I have the rookie guide open right now, and I'm just going to look at his write-ups as we're going through this a little bit and talk to him about it. But there are like 12 plus running backs to potentially discuss. As we were talking before the show, Shawn, you mentioned a couple names that I hadn't really dug into too much, a little further down the list that you like. We're going to talk about a lot of these different running backs today. We'll probably talk about the wide receivers next week as well, but this is the group that is, it's going to be really impactful. And we know that at the running back position for fantasy, I mean, it's not just dynasty, right? Like they can produce as rookies right away. This is the position where teams, when they draft a guy pretty high, they usually give him quite a bit of run pretty early. And I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of rookie running back production in 2025 in the NFL. If this class has anything to say about it, it will be interesting. Some of these guys aren't going to land in the best spots. You mentioned to me before the show, we always get the running backs landing on the teams that don't need running backs. And my comment was, well, I mean, it's kind of because some of the NFL teams don't seem to care about the position and other teams do. And they're like, well, we have a good one, but we think it's important to have depth here. And the other ones are like, well, we don't want to. The Chiefs are like, we don't care. We'll have, all the worst running backs in the league, and we're never going to care about the position. You got some of those types of teams. And we just want a good running back on the Chiefs, but there's never going to be one because they don't care about the position. You've been asking for that since Jonathan Taylor. At any rate, we are going to talk about these backs, try to parse the profiles, try to break them down, understand them a little bit better. We talked about Jeanty a little bit last episode as well. You told me a little bit about how his receiving profile was really interesting. Probably won't spend a lot of time on him, but the rest of this class is very, very interesting. Excited to jump on here with you and get a chance to talk to you about it.
Yeah, you think about last season, even in a very weak class, Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy ended up making a huge difference for us across formats, as you mentioned. Definitely not just Dynasty where this matters. I mean, Bucky was, one of our favorite players ever, and I don't think that we want to undersell him by acting like he wasn't a good prospect. That was one of the things that, got us so interested in him. At the same time, this class is so good. And Ben, there have been classes where in retrospect, I think you can look back and say that it will be hard for the 2025 class to match them. I don't know that going into a draft that there has ever been a class quite like this. Certainly not in recent memory for me in terms of going through the different prospects. We had Scott Barrett on OT, Colin and I, last week, and he was so excited to talk about running backs, more or less refused to talk about the receivers. If you have had a chance to look at my 4-round breakdown of where I think the prospects go, that tracks pretty well, where you're looking at it, you're thinking, okay, well, receivers are going to go in the first 2 days. They're very important to reality teams. You're going to get some sort of floor with them when you have that draft capital. And yet there's such a massive contrast in the strength of the profiles that when you're ranking these players and thinking about how you want to address your own rookie drafts, it basically does just still come out as running back. But when we flip that to other formats, I think that because there are so many and there's going to be some pushback to a redraft ADP or a best ball ADP where a ton of rookies are really high and people are going to want to filter in some veterans, that just that natural layering in of players is going to mean that guys with profiles that frankly are not that dissimilar to guys who actually are quite expensive, because the big name guys in this draft are obviously going to be expensive right away. But you have a chance to really profit in seasonal leagues at the second, third, fourth, fifth tiers. Then this class is so much fun.
You mentioned Bucky. I'm kind of just starting to dig through some of the advanced numbers for the backs and stuff. And I mean, you said, not to say he wasn't a bad prospect. We're kind of talking about how good this class was, but I mean, you go back and you look at his like missed tackle forced numbers. They're right up there. They're not far behind like Ashton Jeanty. And there's not a lot of dudes even in this class that you're talking about so favorably that are even that close to Bucky. So just say, we can't all be Bucky Irving. We can't all be Bucky Irving.
Well, when I look at the last 3 years in the Sports Info Solution numbers and look at power conference players, you look at the evasion rate, which when I'm talking about that from the SIS side, that's the combination of broken tackles and forced missed tackles. A forced missed tackle when the defender would be there in position to make a tackle and not get a hand on the back. Obviously, those are the plays, to my mind, that are most fun when the guys beat the defender without him even being able to touch you. But Bucky Irving, number 1 from the 2022 year, and number 4 from the 2023 year. So again, even in the context of this class, Bucky is at the top.
That's over a multi-year stretch. He has 2 of the top 5 years. He was pretty incredible. Yeah, you mentioned it. It's a great thing to mention. I'm typically, if I throw any numbers out here, I'm looking at some PFF numbers. When I say missed tackle force, it's sort of their version of what you just defined. You're going to be calling evasion rate from the SIS numbers. I know a lot of people are like, why don't you guys just use the same numbers? Well, the different data sources don't necessarily use the same numbers, in part because it's hard to quantify data in the football space. We've dealt with this for a lot of years, that there's not a lot of consistency necessarily. So you get it from us in part because that's just the reality of the sport of football and what we're dealing with. But we are both talking about numbers. When I say missed tackles forced, and you said forced missed tackles, which is one of the 2 parts of evasion rate over at SIS. Missed tackles forced at PFF is all of it's both broken and evaded. Anyway, this is going to be somewhat confusing. But let's talk about the top of the class. So Ashton Jeanty, we talked about last time, is an incredible prospect. The next guy on almost everybody's list is Omarian Hampton from North Carolina. In my notes, when I read through your write-up on him, I was like, all right, he's big, he's fast, he's got receiving. This is the type of stuff that I like to look for. I always think of that David Johnson mold, right? Like if you have size, speed combo, and some receiving numbers, you're a 3-down profile. This is great for fantasy football. Anyone who knows about my high-value touches that I like to talk about over at the Stealing Signals newsletter, I'm looking at receptions and goal line. You need size for goal line. You need that size speed element. But a lot of those backs can't catch. They can't catch the ball in between the 20s and be the receiving back. Again, this is the 3-down profile. And my point about the high value touch note is that's where fantasy ceiling comes from, the combination of receiving and touchdowns. And to get that, you need this size, speed, receiving profile. Omarian Hampton has that. It's exciting. He has the potential draft capital. A lot of talk that he's going to be the second running back taken potentially in the first round, potentially another first round pick. Ginty may go in the top 10 for all we know at this point, or it seems like that's like very possible. But Hampton may go before the end of the first round on that first night, which would be huge for him. My big question to you is whether he is closer to Ashton Ginty, who everyone is saying is this can't miss prospect, than the rest of the pack, because there's a lot of more intriguing running backs we're going to get to. And you mentioned to me a few of them before the show. I'm trying to figure out, is he this clear number 2, or is he a half tier up from those other guys and a full tier behind Ginty? Where does he fit in that gap between Ginty and the rest of this really good class from RB3 down to however far it goes, RB12, RB15?
Yeah, his numbers are immaculate. His closest comps in the box score scout, which includes a huge production element and then an athletic element, are Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook. If you got what Breece Hall, should have been and hopefully still will be, if you got those peak seasons from Dalvin Cook after you drafted Hampton, you would be pretty excited about that. I think that to answer your question, maybe I would put him more just exactly in the middle as opposed to closer to one side or the other. Anytime that you come out and you are a young player, this class, and you can argue that it doesn't make as much difference maybe at running back, but I still really like to have that for a variety of reasons. One of the young players in this class, which is nice, you get that combination of production and athleticism. When you're 221 pounds and you've got a 96th percentile explosion score, you've got to like that. The huge raw production. When we look at things in the RB prospect lab at RotoViz, it's easy to get caught up almost exclusively in things like the peripherals and things like the athleticism and forget that just one of the biggest signals you can possibly get is, did the team feel like they had to use this player on every play, and then did he come through, right? If you have 1,700 yards from scrimmage and then 2,000 yards from scrimmage. So again, it's not a one-year wonder element either, right? If you're, again, just really checking all the boxes with this type of player. Now, the two tiny little things I would say with him, especially when you have a class that is this talented and when you have someone like Ginty at the top, that 4.46 at 221, which still gives you an excellent freak score, but not an unreal type of size, speed profile there. I mean, that's splitting hairs a little bit. When we're talking about Ginty, though, being potentially, the best prospect, running back prospect since Christian McCaffrey and Barry Sanders, I think we're probably not quite there with Hampton. The other tiny little bit of a concern, which I've talked with some folks, maybe doesn't show up as much in the PFF numbers, but the evasion rates for Hampton are actually not that great, especially in 2023. Now, the numbers certainly look fine in 2024. So again, we're talking about like the tiniest of warts. He was below 20% evasion in 2023. Now, his yards after contact per attempt, despite that, were still more or less off the charts. So when he did make guys miss, when he did break a tackle or evade a tackle, you're talking about someone there who was able to turn it into a lot of yardage, actually more yards after contact per attempt in 2023 than in 2024 when his evasion rate actually jumped to the level that I would feel comfortable with. I always encourage people to think about the yards as being the thing that matters, not the broken tackles, which don't actually help your reality team unless they translate into yards, and don't help your fantasy team unless they translate into yards. But I think that, again, if you wanted to pick out the tiniest of little warts, it's that is going to be against an ACC caliber of competition that's probably not as strong as the SEC and the Big Ten. And if you're looking at it from that perspective and you're thinking, okay, some of these yards are a tiny bit fraudulent because maybe you're not facing the elite of collegiate defenses. I mean, you can throw those in as concerns, but basically this is a really, really good prospect.
Yeah, anytime I see Charles Sims' name as the top comp in the prospect workout explorer, I get a little too excited. Charles Sims was a favorite, even though he never really panned out excitingly in the fantasy space. The size, the speed, all those elements that's the dream, right? That's the idea, the 3-down profile, but that makes sense on him. So, okay, we have Hampton, though, as a pretty clear number 2, the consensus. Not everyone's number 2, but he's like nowhere far behind that. If he's not your number 2, he's probably your number 3 or maybe your number 4 or something. But for the most part, seems to be viewed a tier up from the rest of the group. When we get down to like number 3 and beyond, there are a lot of names that get brought up. You have Travion Henderson from Ohio State, plus his teammate Quinshon Judkins from Ohio State. I was telling you before the show, I have a hard time keeping them apart or telling them apart. Henderson's the one that's viewed, I think, a little bit more favorably. You mentioned he's sort of like the Jahmyr Gibbs to Judkins, sort of Josh Jacobs-y type profile to look at 2 Alabama backs in recent classes. Henderson a little bit more fast, a little bit more of an explosive play guy. Those 2 come into play for a lot of people. Caleb Johnson from Iowa comes into play for a lot of people. I know he has some really intriguing metrics. I mean, there's several others that I think I don't even know who to say next, but like I'm looking at the first version of the RotoViz guide. You have Dylan Sampson coming up next. I know he has some good missed tackle force numbers. You mentioned DJ Giddens to me before the show. Cam Scataboo, you mentioned to me. Scataboo. I don't know how to say his name. Seems to be getting docked because he's white, but otherwise it seems to have a lot of really good profile, really good peripherals and a strong profile. Although my one note on him that I wanted to ask you about is, I read your write-up on him. It's very positive. It was just, is he too old? Because he's a redshirt senior. He has this really strong last final season. He's a 23-year-old back already. I mean, there's so many other names. Bashalt Tuton's another name you threw out to me that I know a lot of people like from a peripheral standpoint. Where do you go next? Like, how do you start to classify this group as you move beyond those first 2? Where is it? Different styles of backs? Is it a straight ranking? Is it tiers? Like, how are you trying to parse, now that you've done a lot more research than me or most of the listeners? How do you try to parse the rest of the group beyond those top 2 names?
I think it has to be the Ohio State backs next, in part because they blew up the combine and really solidified things there, in part because they were both so spectacular as freshmen in college and then have other numbers to back that up. And in part because I do think that combination of the high profile college there with Ohio State, what they did with the combine, with the numbers, that they're probably looking at being the next guy is taken. If you disagree with that, and certainly there's enough depth here that easily other people could be in the mix. If you do have other guys jump up, get drafted earlier, and then specifically go into spots where the workload is there, then you would juggle this around. I think that Scataboo, Giddens, Tuton, and Caleb Johnson, as you mentioned, are all guys who have an argument for going next. And a lot of what we're going to see in terms of how it actually does shake out is going to be expectations that are related not to talent, but are related to what the expected workload is as a rookie. Having said that, I think that Henderson at this point is a player that, especially with what we've got with Jahmyr Gibbs, you've got to be incredibly excited about, because really, so there are going to be 2 red flags with him. One, the evasion numbers are not necessarily there to be this elite back. And then you have this sort of weird career where his freshman season, he looks like he's going to be a guy, who could be a future top 10 pick. You have a couple of down years, and then he comes back. And one of the elements when you're trying to decide between Henderson and Judkins is just that he was so dramatically better than his likely ultra-talented teammate that has to be a bit of a separator for you. But one of the things that happened with Gibbs that has been interesting is that despite all of the things that had us really excited about him, that had Blair writing things like he's the most undervalued player in every format in all of history, et cetera, and that basically coming true, is that Gibbs' evasion numbers within the context of what expectations would be have been a lot better at the NFL level than they were in college. You've talked about how these teams, and I do think that Gibbs has panned out in a way and is just so clearly, if not the best running back in the NFL, then he is putting a real challenge into Saquon Barkley and Bijan Robinson. But you do have to give the Lions some credit also, right? The scheme and what they're creating is helping him get into a situation where he's having some one-on-ones where if you win that one-on-one, you get a chance to win on one-on-one, because if it's him versus one guy, that chance to make the guy completely miss is great. If it's him versus one guy and he wants to run through him, again, that's great, because then once you make that guy miss, you're not being dragged down in a pile, and then you can really run. If we get a similar type of situation from Henderson is very intuitive. He's got great production. He's going to be someone who is a freak receiver at the NFL level, but he's so athletic that if he's not having to deal with a bunch of guys simultaneously, he's just going to be off to the races over and over and over. He's someone where, despite the 4.43 40, which you might even argue is a little bit disappointing, his actual top speed during the 40 was 23.4, which the second fastest at that position behind Raheem Sanders. It was better than some other guys I absolutely love, like Brashard Smith, who has blazing speed. I mean, this is a guy who then also, just like we talked about with Hampton, the explosion numbers are off the charts. You're talking about the combination of an intuitive runner with huge raw production who is an almost incomparable athlete. It's almost a deal where unless Henderson gets stuck in a terrible spot as a professional, I just think he's going to be off to the races right off the bat. And he does look like someone who, even at lofty prices, is probably undervalued.
So Henderson makes a lot of sense as sort of the RB3, but Judkins is one that people are shying away from, I guess, a little bit. It seems like, as I try to read the room a little bit on social and some of the other comments, you said to me before the show that you're maybe a little bit higher on him than some others. There's some real positives to his profile as well. He's not just like the other guy in this situation coming out of this backfield, right?
Yeah, so I think the question that people have with him in some ways that is backed up by the lack of efficiency is just how intuitive he is, and that kind of contrast with Henderson, where we know that he has that. But you're talking about Judkins being someone who finished 1 yard short of 1,700 scrimmage yards as a freshman, 17 total touchdowns in 13 games. Everybody knows that he is the guy who's coming, and the numbers are all there. Then you have a 4.48 40 at 221 pounds. We're talking about 98th percentile explosion. I have in my notes here in the write-up that his 10-yard split was actually even a tick faster than Henderson's. And the problem for him is that as he moves through his career, in his sophomore season, the 4.3 yards per carry is just a deal breaker for a huge number of people, and I think justifiably so. Then you have that final season where the contrast with Henderson is so large that, again, people are worried about that. One of the things I would say is that the sophomore season, even though it's disconcerting, SIS has him for 52 broken tackles. Now, not, totally evaded tackles, but just the broken tackle variety, which they have as the most for any power conference back in the last 5 years. And so I'm looking at that 4.3 and I'm thinking, again, like, you got to gain yards. But he was fighting people off. He's breaking tackles. You consider the freshman season, the athleticism, the broken tackles. And then again, even for someone where you're like, okay, maybe the various comps for him would be in some range of like Nick Chubb, Darius Geis, Rashard Mendenhall. Geis and Mendenhall, maybe we don't have the clearest view of what they would have been as NFL players for various circumstances. That doesn't, Chubb obviously would be fantastic, even though the fantasy profile was troubling at times. But those other two names maybe don't get you that excited. But this is a guy where if things break a little bit right, and that includes the fact that there's some receiving value with Judkins as well, maybe not that big of a surprise because of how athletic he is. I think that part of what's happening with Judkins is just the class is so good that you end up having your red flags are really exaggerated. You compare Judkins to a bunch of backs who are currently in the NFL who have the grinder profile and aren't remotely as athletic. It's hard for me to look at what he's done and not see somebody who's going to have a very good NFL career unless he somehow gets drafted by a team that doesn't actually like his profile. And then we would think that wouldn't happen. But we do see it happen where teams draft guys and then seem like, oh, we thought you were something completely different.
I love that note that in a class like this, the red flags get magnified because he's being compared to all of these other backs who all have really strong profiles, but you're talking about a multi-year lens. I think that's a really sharp thing to consider, but also a sharp way of, just looking at it and approaching it as an analyst. It's funny. I'm looking at some of my notes here, and we didn't get all the way down the quarterback group, but Jackson Dart, you had a nice positive write-up about, and you wrote that he had he gapped the class on a few of the key stats with 70% on target rate, 15% TD rate on deep passes, some of that stuff. But I wrote in my notes, the question I want to ask you about him was like, is gapping the class partially because his class is weak because some of the other passers are maybe not? And so it's so funny the way that these guys get put into these situations, obviously, and they're compared to other players. And that's where some of the biggest value has come in the NFL draft is in some of these really sort of deep positional groups. Some good prospects get pushed down. And I think that's the point you're making here with Quinshon Judkins is you can make an excuse to push him down because you like other guys ahead of him, but that doesn't mean that Judkins himself was a bad prospect, right? It means that, and the reasons that players hit aren't solely identifiable in their statistical profiles is the other thing. So when you mentioned his sophomore year, 4.3 yards per carry being a potential deal breaker for some, or at least a red flag, it doesn't mean that kind of thing means that he can never be productive at the NFL level when there's all these other things working for him. The overall athleticism for this type of a player, the freshman season being as good as it was just before that 4.3 yards per carry sophomore season, all of those other things you're mentioning, it creates this range of outcomes, this probabilistic bet on this player. And yes, maybe it feels like he's less exciting because of a little bit of a red flag, but it's still an interesting profile overall. Anyway, I just thought that was a really, conceptually is a really interesting thought experiment about how we go about thinking about rookies and prospects and deciding whether or not they're even worth betting on, and sometimes getting way too certain because the reality is there's a lot of uncertainty. I think that's a huge part of your point here. We have to remember the uncertainty. We're looking at positives and negatives and trying to figure out where does that put us in terms of the uncertainty that we know exists. Let's talk about Caleb Johnson a little bit because he's the one that I'm seeing pretty high up. I have the Athletics big board open right now. Dane Brugler does awesome work over there. He has him as the RB2 at 35th overall with Omarian Hampton at 36 overall, one spot behind him on the overall big board. But obviously very lofty for Caleb Johnson there. They have Trayvon Henderson a few slots behind that as the RB4. Johnson, I've seen a lot of really positive stuff about. I know you had some really positive stuff in there. I wrote in my notes after reading your write-up, maybe the RB3. I also wrote that I know you want to look at the comps as I always have a tendency to want to look at comps as something more than it is, and you guys give a little bit of a range. His closest match was Mikel Lashore on the initial write-up, but you also have like Doug Martin as the dream scenario, and I don't know. I liked his comps overall. What do you think about Caleb Johnson coming out of Idaho? Seemed to have a little bit of a tough second year as well. 3 college years. Numbers were down a little bit that middle year, but were good again last year. Like for the numbers I have for missed tackles forced per touch were really strong. His first and third seasons, really strong, but were much weaker the second year. But he didn't have a ton of touches, only 120 total touches that second season. Wasn't really healthy, you were saying to me before the show. What do you think about him overall?
He's one I do think is tricky to get a good feel for, because a lot of it is based on just completely and totally carrying the Iowa offense. And then if you're trying to decide between players with this general profile who are athletic and players with this general profile who have athletic questions, which I think that you could argue that Caleb Johnson does. Now, I put him at 202 in my rankings of where I feel like these guys should go. But most of it I really dedicated to this idea that the 4.57 at 224 is not necessarily a deal breaker. That we had Derrick Henry, run a 4.54 and in his 30s is posting some of the fastest on-field times in the NFL. Johnson did have one of the fastest on-field times in college football last year. Again, I mean, those are going to mostly come from long runs where you break into the open and you're able to hit a good top speed, but you still do kind of like that, because if a guy does break into the open, you need, that full play. I mean, this is a person who, 6.4 yards per attempt last year. So you get the big, just raw number there. You get the 3.9 yards after contact. You get the 25% evasion rate. He's got this great mix of yards after contact overall at 936, touchdowns at 21, broken tackles 36, additional 23 forced missed tackles, 71 first downs, 22 receptions, a great receiver rating. His receiving yards after contact were fantastic. It's again kind of a thing where you go down and you look at him and how he carries the Hawkeyes, and you're thinking that's a kind of a checks all the boxes type of profile. I guess my concern would still be that the athleticism isn't necessarily there to separate him from a lot of other guys who are interesting. I think you got to be careful with looking at the next gen numbers and saying, okay, well, next gen has him here. This is probably where he goes. But the next gen algorithm has him ranked 10th among running backs. And I think that that is also perfectly justifiable and is kind of, vaguely in the range of where I have him. I have him a little bit higher than that, but there are some other guys who are probably still more interesting.
And those ones, looking at your write-up that you referenced, include DJ Giddens, who I mentioned at the top. You said to me before the show, and then Cam Scataboo, who you also mentioned to me in a lot of ways his numbers are comparable to Ginty. Like they are the closest thing. I'm looking at the missed tackles forced per touch stuff. I mean, he's meaningfully ahead of the other guys on this list. Now, the issue with Scataboo is he's 23. I mean, he was a redshirt senior this year. My big note there is, is this guy too old? So, yeah, I guess hit on both of those guys. I want to hear your thoughts on Giddens as well, who I know I'm looking at your write-up here. You have some good notes on his receiving as well, which, again, always fun to see a back that can catch some passes, maybe play in a 3-down role. Scataboo's receiving was impressive too.
Yeah, both of these guys, big-time receiving backs. Giddens is somebody, and talking with a variety of people who are pretty tuned into the college football stuff, I can't get them on board, and so I'm probably wrong. And yet, when I watch him play, that ability to change directions without losing speed is something that you see so similarly to Bucky. And the thing with Irving is that his tested athleticism was poor, which is not the case with Giddens, where you have that 4.43 40, you have 97th percentile explosion. And then you look at the results, right? Where among guys with 200 carries last year, Giddens trails only GT and RJ Harvey. RJ Harvey being the other guy who's probably pretty wildly undervalued, even though people love him, right? It's just you get compressed where you can't have everybody ranked number 2, number 3. There were the only 2 guys above him in terms of yards per attempt. Giddens and GT were the only 2 guys to average at least 3.5 after contact and 3.0 before contact. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that like he and GT are separated out from everybody else. But the reason I note that is that Ben, when we kind of talk through the backs, when I write the 0 RB universe during the season, all of those types of things, I really like guys who do both things. And I always sort of mention one of the ways to think about that and help you understand why it would be valuable is like, that's how you get to be Jamal Charles. Like you can't get up there unless your efficiency in both categories is very, very good. The evasion numbers were where you wanted it, but it's also something where in the last 2 years, he averaged over 11 yards per reception, over 11 yards per reception as a running back, right? Just short of 400 routes across those years, 102 air yards. Now people are thinking 102 air yards is not a lot of air yards, but you think about these running backs and a lot of them are in the negative, right? I mean, you're catching the balls behind the line of scrimmage. 566 yards after contact as a receiver. To me, this is the type of profile where when you have efficiency, you have receiving, you have great athleticism, you have the overall total production, you're really fun to watch. I mean, the really fun to watch probably doesn't matter, but it is one of those things where every once in a while when you watch somebody that nobody else seems like that high on and like, okay, well, I can see it. I mean, he's running into these massive holes. He's not really doing anything himself. That's not the case for Giddens. I'm probably wrong on this one, but for me, this is exactly what I'm looking for in a running back.
So that's, I mean, a really fun stamp. And again, because this is such a deep class, this is a guy that's maybe falling farther than he should. I mean, one of the things is like, I mean, I'm sure for listeners are like, okay, now this is the point in the episode where if they aren't very familiar with the running back class yet, they're like, this is where I'm starting to not keep everyone straight. I've heard a little bit about this other player that hasn't been mentioned yet or whatever. There are enough names that you get 4 or 5, you're like, okay, so who GT's the star, who's the next guy, who are the next 3 or 4 guys? We mentioned the Ohio State guys, start to get to like the 5th, 6th, 7th guys, and the names start running together a little bit. But the point, again, to the earlier conversation about these ranges of outcomes, the probabilistic bets, and there being a lot of really good prospects here, is not that all of them are going to hit, but that they're all good bets, right? They're all really intriguing bets. And so if you are in a rookie draft before the NFL draft, I mean, a lot of the landing spot and draft capital stuff is going to matter for these guys big time. But if you are in a rookie draft before the NFL draft, I mean, you want to be considering ways that you can get access to multiple of these guys, and especially the cheaper ones. If DJ Giddens possibly because of what you're saying, that not a lot of other people are as high as him on him as you. If he becomes cheaper, if he becomes a late 2nd round pick or an early 3rd round pick.
I think he could be a late 2nd or early 3rd round pick.
And if somebody's able to trade in and get exposure to him there, and all these things you're saying, I mean, that's what we're looking for in fantasy, is not just the players that everyone agrees on, but the players that people don't agree on, but look really good on the stuff that we want to bet on, right? And that's what you're saying is we have here is a guy who checks the boxes from an efficiency standpoint, from an advanced peripheral standpoint, from a receiving standpoint, from a physicality standpoint, from your eye test. You were just saying that he looks really good. Watching him, that's a fun name for sure. And Scataboo, you keep telling me, again, even though he's white, I'm having a hard time with it, Sean.
The numbers here are absurd, right? And you keep like, how can we really express how absurd they are? People are just like, well, yeah, I mean, you gained a lot of yards in college. That's fine. One of the things I think that there's like maybe I'm just making this up. Maybe this doesn't exist at all, but he has this high profile game against Texas at the end of the season where I think people get concerned that they're overvaluing the last thing that they saw. And like, you got to remember, like, one game isn't everything. And the last thing you saw is, I think fantasy managers get really good at that now, certainly compared to where they were in the past. I mean, 242 yards from scrimmage and 2 touchdowns, right? That's a big game. But then you go back through it and you're like, okay, well, the week before he had 208 scrimmage yards and 3 touchdowns against Iowa State. The week before that, he had 185 and 3 against Arizona. A couple of weeks before that, he had 274 and 3 against Oklahoma State. The week before that, he had 199 and 2 against Utah. I'm not 100% sure what he had the week before that against Kansas. I have it down here as 2,015 yards. I'm pretty sure it's just 200 and something.
It's 200. It's 201 yards. I'm looking at his game log right now. 201 total yards. Not quite 2015.
Right. A couple of weeks before that, 297 against Mississippi State. Right? So like you could have like turned on the TV, watched any of those games and be like, I got to remember that like he's just not that game. It was like all the games, right? Which is
how you even skipped 177 against Texas Tech in there where he had 117 receiving and only 60 rushing yards, but yeah, a pair of touchdowns. It's all the games. I'm looking at his game log. It's all the games. The games that you're skipping when you go 2 weeks earlier are 100 and 105 total yards. They're still good games. The only games that he didn't have 100 total yards were against Wyoming and Texas Tech or Texas State early in the year, where it's like, I mean, this Texas State one's weird. They only won by 3 points, and he did actually get 27 touches and only had 83 yards. Texas State is the one team that shut down Cameron Scataboo. But he actually got touches. Yeah,
Texas State.
But the first game against Wyoming, they won 48-7. He only got 12 touches. That's why he didn't get to 100. I mean, they just sat him. It's the opening game of the year.
So when you look at the points above average per attempt, which is a charting and EPA, so it's an EPA number that is then adjusted for a variety of things, including the charting that SI has. He edges Ashton Jeanty in that. Nobody's saying, although, I mean, it might be fun to start being the person who is saying it. Like, no one's saying he's better than Jeanty, but like he was at 55%.
That was such a shock. Devil on the shoulder moment. It might be fun to start saying it.
55% positive for him, Jeanty at 50%. Those positive numbers, by the way, are really, really high. He had 30% evasion. His 1,144 yards after the contact, most among power conference backs in the last 5 years. I always love to mention, like, Arizona State, the Sun Devils doing everything they can for him. You pull up his bio on the Arizona State page, and you'll be like, I'm drafting this guy 101. It's everything about how Christian McCaffrey and Adrian Peterson are the only 2 similar backs in the history of the world. But if you got Christian McCaffrey and Adrian Peterson, you'd be pretty happy, right? So, again, the reason that he is kind of valued the way he is that people don't think he's athletic enough to do any of that at the NFL level. I think you want to keep that in mind. But as you go through and once you get to certain prices, it becomes, I was going to say pretty clear cut. But again, I mean, RJ Harvey is another name that I want to mention who also has these stats where you're like, how is this even possible? Right? You're going to have to decide between some of these guys. And then if you need a receiver or you need one of these really good tight ends or one of the QBs that we hate falls to you super deep in the draft, and you're like, well, at that price, right? So it's not like the choices are going to ever become easy, but at a certain point, when you're looking at that much production, I think it's pretty hard to turn away. The other thing that you kind of see with him, and you look at some of these numbers, you look at the evasion, all of that stuff, is that you don't succeed very well at the NFL level if you don't run hard. Most of the guys run pretty hard. Every once in a while, we get backs like David Montgomery, who you're like, yeah, he's really pretty limited, but even among NFL players, seems to run harder. The way that Scataboo got to some of these numbers is that, I mean, he takes the run hard thing almost to, a caricature type level, which again, I mean, NFL teams like that kind of thing, and you should like that kind of thing. I would be shocked if his team doesn't fall in love with him, right? Which again, then you're talking about a number of carries that is helpful, even if, some of these NFL defenders can do to him things that the college guys evidently were not able to do.
But you mentioned the athleticism, and he did have a pretty poor 40 time. He did give, I saw good explosion numbers testing wise, good jumps. You're not concerned about the 40 time. You're not concerned about the 23-year-old age.
Well, Ben, he had an interesting journey to this point where he was a massive star in high school, was not still someone who drew the interest of big collegiate programs. In 2022, Sacramento State has a monster season. Then he goes, obviously has the years at Arizona State, culminating with the insane 2,300 yards from scrimmage this last year. Again, all the stuff we talked about with the rushing, I mean, it's over 600 receiving yards. Yeah, you would prefer him to be younger. You prefer him to be more athletic. If those things were true about him, then he would be fighting Ashton GT for the top pick. I'm pretty excited about him. I mean,
he's sort of always been good. I'm looking at his Wikipedia now, and he rushed for 3,550 yards as a junior in high school, 42 touchdowns, team won the state championship. And as you mentioned, Sacramento State, he was really good. 2020 was his first year in Sacramento State. They didn't have a season. And so then, that kind of slows him down. It's part of why he's 23 was the pandemic. I mean, we're still seeing the effects of that on some of these prospect profiles. So it's interesting to see him have such huge numbers in high school, succeed at the Sacramento State level, succeed at the Arizona State level. If your guy's going to be old, at least he's been good at various ages and at various places, right?
Yeah, and Harvey has a similar kind of situation where his trajectory made it difficult for him to put up numbers before he got to the 2024 season, at which point he's old. And yet when you look at what he did in 2024, it eliminates a lot of those concerns. And again, I mean, we're looking at a little bit of a similar thing to Tyrone Tracy, right? Where with him, the position change means that he really only had that 1 year there to show what he could do as running back. But again, these guys, even being older, not as old as Tyrone Tracy and much, much bigger production. And Tyrone Tracy looked good last year.
That's right. So another name we haven't mentioned yet is, I mean, we've gone through a ton of names. And this is where you're like, okay, are we running out? Oh, we haven't even done Bashalt Tuton yet. I'm scrolling through. There's so many interesting names. Tuton's one we mentioned earlier, 4'3", 240. He's like 206 pounds, I think you guys have it listed as. You, in your blurb, in your write-up of your 4-round Superflex rookie mock over on the site at RotoViz, wrote, anytime a player goes out the combine and looks like a supercharged version of Jamal Charles, you've got to be careful about an overreaction, except that's your highest compliment when you start to compare guys to Jamal Charles, especially a supercharged version of Jamal Charles. This guy's not small. He's over 200 pounds, but he's running a 4.32. He is just was the buzz of the combine. I mean, there was a lot of buzz out of the combine, obviously, but I remember tracking that a little bit more loosely as I'm not as tied into all the numbers and seeing that a lot of people were really excited about this time for Tuton, who also has a really interesting profile. You had written him up favorably prior to that. Great peripherals for him. Why is he not like the RB3 in the class? What am I missing with him?
Some of the scouts are not convinced that some of these Virginia Tech numbers are going to translate that well. It was interesting in that even though his athleticism really is just off the charts, like the max speed was not quite as high, which is sort of interesting. But I mean, this is a guy who 3.7 yards after contact per attempt and a 29% evasion rate in 2023. Those numbers jumped to 3.8 and a 34% evasion in 2024. Despite this kind of track background that he has, his evasion numbers were actually skewed to the broken tackles with 30 plus in each of his Division I seasons. He has a super high backfield dominator rating, which obviously Blair writes about every year and is something I do like to see for some of these guys who are not considered to be the the very top cream of the crop types of players. I don't really understand it. You look at the points above average per attempt numbers that I was mentioning. His are the best among any of the 2024 prospects. To be selling on Tuton, you sort of have to take the athleticism and take the on-field production and then make the case that, I mean, the size is a little bit of an issue potentially, right? He's also short, which could be a little bit of a problem there. But you've got to take the athleticism and you've got to take the on-field production and then come back around and say that stylistically he doesn't have what we want. I mean, that's really the only way you get to Tuton not being just one of the very most exciting guys in the class. And so, again, I think that there is a concern that people have, and rightly, that when someone blows up the combine to this extent, that you don't want to be the sucker, right? You don't want to be the guy who is picking him in drafts, because then you're the person out of everybody who was the highest on that and maybe understands the rest of the context the least. I think that's the concern people have. I would say it is relevant that scouts were not particularly high on him, and so you don't want to fade that entirely, but the results are there. If you're that athletic and the results were there, I think you have to take that seriously. I think this is one of those situations where there's an opportunity to benefit from the fact that we now have a more sober, more educated group of drafters, especially high volume drafters, that maybe have some psychological tools. I wouldn't say that they're flaws, but just tools that are keeping someone's ADP down in a viable range, where in the past, maybe we would have seen even more enthusiasm that would have got him up where he deserved to be.
But also, there's just so many names that, I mean, I'm like taking notes. So we Giddens was the one that was, your guy kind of, but then Scataboo, you basically said would be right behind Gene T, if not for some of these little minor things. And now Tuton is that guy. This is why we said this running back class is very interesting. There are very many names the further we get down that are really interesting. You started to talk about RJ Harvey. Did you want to discuss him a little bit more as well?
Well, I don't even really know what to do with RJ Harvey, right? I mean, you've got a guy who 205 pounds, 4.40. He had a faster max speed than Tuton, right? 92nd percentile explosion. This guy averaged 150 yards from scrimmage. He scored 25 touchdowns. I mean, he was the UCF offense, and you can argue that the UCF offense was helpful to him in terms of generating quite that much value, but they were bad, right? So even if you say, okay, it's built around him, it's a little bit of a cheat code for him to get these numbers, it's also a situation where everybody knew that Harvey is how UCF is going to try and get the job done, and they couldn't stop him. I mean, he's scoring touchdowns at will, right? 61 receptions over the last 3 years, 720 receiving yards. And like Giddens, this is another back where you watch him and you're thinking to yourself, like, this dude is so fun. I mean, he looks like a faster version of Bucky Irving. Or, I mean, he was kind of reminding me a little bit of LaShawn McCoy, except LaShawn McCoy, for as unbelievable as he was, and obviously if you drafted RJ Harvey and you got LaShawn McCoy, you'd be like, jackpot. But LaShawn McCoy spent a lot of time going east-west, right? He was like a slower, more, even more elusive version of Kenneth Walker, where at some point, if you had him and you're watching, you're like, run toward the end zone. I mean, Harvey, again, this downfield aspect of it, or the downhill, I should say, aspect of it, like a Bucky Irving, where with Irving, right, he breaks those tackles and then he's getting down the field.
Gone.
And you're like, yeah, how did a dude who is like 190 pounds and runs a 4.6 40 just have a 50-yard run? It's like, well, he saw the hole, he got to it, and then he like ran for the end zone, no screwing around.
When he evades the tackles too, he evades them in ways that like he keeps his balance so well. Like he'll do a little step back and like let a guy overrun, and then he's gone out the other. Like right as that guy passes him, he's moving up field instead of still slowly, juking him out. Anyway, we were talking about Bucky Irving, so I needed to chime in.
I mean, Bucky.
He's fun to watch. He's fun to watch. No, your LaShawn McCoy point, you said he's like a little bit more elusive Kenneth Walker. I always said with LaShawn McCoy, he was a less elusive Barry Sanders, but really the closest thing we would have to Sanders in the way that he would dance around in the backfield some and then get out the other side. Didn't quite have everything Barry Sanders had, but Barry Sanders famously had the most negative rushing yards, most lost rushing yards with a lot of his, home run traits. But obviously we all love and have seen the highlights and love the highlights of the ones where he did hit the home runs. The Barry Sanders runs are incredible, but McCoy would always do that stuff too. So anyway, McCoy. I love that description of him. A more elusive Kenneth Walker or a less elusive Barry Sanders. He's somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah. I mean, with Walker, you're like, you've got the long speed. Let's use it.
Let's just run
sideline to sideline.
Yeah.
I mean, Harvey, again, these numbers in relatively few games, right? Over 1,600 yards from scrimmage in 2023, over 1,800 in 2024. That's a 13-game season and a 12-game season. We're talking about 43 combined touchdowns across those 2 years. I mean, this is a little dude, but not a small dude, and somebody who, if that makes sense, somebody who gets in the end zone. Right. I think that when we're thinking of Harvey, it's that same type of deal where you're looking at a 3-down back. And even if he's not 220, this is a touchdown maker.
So there's another, hopefully day 2 pick. Maybe he's an early day 3 pick. We'll see how it goes. He's 24. He's another older back, but another one that if the landing spot's there, if the capital's there, he's going to be a favorite, right? There's a lot of dudes in this class. It is a fun group. I want to ask you about a name. Well, oh no, we haven't done Dylan Sampson yet either. And you note in your write-up that he's, a 21-year-old rookie you wrote with an exclamation point. We actually have a young dude here. He has really good peripherals too. You had him at 211 in your write-up. In your initial rookie guide, you had him a little bit higher, it seemed like. He was like, I know you don't necessarily do it in a specific order. It's not like a ranked order where you write the profiles, but they're a rough order, right? You start with Ginty and Omarian Hampton and whatnot. You had him as the 6th back that you wrote up there. And the profile looks pretty interesting to me when I'm kind of looking at it. There's some receiving there, not a massive amount, but there's some. There's good like missed tackles forced per touch, which by the way, RJ Harvey's numbers as well. While you're talking about that, I was looking him up. Were like really good, like really, really good in the evasion stuff and that yards after contact stuff. I mean, he looks fun, man. You're making all these dudes sound fun. But Dylan Sampson, what is it? Just that all the other guys are so fun? Like, what is it about him that makes him a little bit more of a late second at this point?
Yeah, I think I would have liked to have seen even more athleticism again within the context of this class when you're thinking about how all these guys are going to go. If you're a shorter back, if you're 200 pounds, you would just like to have that Tuton level athleticism in order to stand out because there are so many extremely athletic guys in this group. But he's someone where the peripherals in 2023, for example, when he's sharing the field with Jalen Wright, his points above average per attempt better, positive rate better, boom percent better, bust percent better, evasion rate better, the yards per route run, encouraging all of those types of things. And then he comes out as the focal point in 2024 and goes for over 1,600 scrimmage yards with 22 touchdowns. I mean, we're not talking about, a 2030 season or something like that. But I mean, the 1,600 yard, 22 touchdown seasons, especially again, in a circumstance where it's 13 games, not the 12 that we saw for Harvey, but it's also not like 15 or 16 games like are now possible for some of these backs, the guys who go, deep in the CFB playoffs, obviously. That's a lot of just raw production for someone whose peripherals were already fantastic. And again, it's right back into the circumstance where the receiving numbers weren't huge, but they were very efficient. And so when you look at how he would be deployed at the NFL level, I mean, I guess my concern, and one of the reasons I dropped him a little bit in this rankings pass, was that I think that there are a lot of guys who probably are ahead of him in 2024 in terms of what we can expect for rookie season usage. But the overall profile for Sampson, again, very, very encouraging. Kevin, who did so much of the work on the rookie guide and did a fantastic, fantastic job. I mean, he has Sampson very, very high. I think there's a lot of reason to be high on him. When we talked with Travis May on OT, Travis, very tuned in to the rookie stuff. He was certainly saying that Sampson, even with the Tennessee offense and how there are some elements there where people look at that unit as being one that can boost production maybe in ways that aren't completely representative sometimes. He wasn't having an issue with that portion of it. Sampson, again, just another one of these guys who is very exciting. And yet, Ben, we're pushing guys like Jarquez Hunter and Ollie Gordon, regardless of what you think about Gordon, pushing them down well into round 3 of rookie drafts. And then you've got names like Trevor Etienne. I mean, Brashard Smith is somebody who, I don't have a great feel for where he's going to go, but you're talking about like the Tyrone Tracy 2.0 here, except like maybe even way better. And the list just goes on and on and on with this class, where we've been mostly talking about guys who have some workhorse potential. There is a huge group of complementary backs in this class that also is fun, right? These guys probably aren't going to win your league for you by themselves as rookies. But when you think about how the NFL does work now, there may be individual games. There certainly are going to be roles for these players at the NFL level. And again, Ben, if it's for the Kansas City Chiefs, it was like simply drafting like a role player who could, play 7 or 8 snaps and actually bring some excitement. There are so many guys who could do that in 2024.
Yeah, there's a bunch more down there. We were talking about Dylan Sampson there. I just wanted to give a couple little more notes on him. I think the really exciting thing for him, for me, and probably for someone like Kevin, who you mentioned really likes him, is just that he is so young. And you get there's rushing efficiency here. You mentioned that the athleticism wasn't elite, but it wasn't bad. You ran I see it as a 4.42, I think. But yeah, as a 21-year-old, and then on his receiving stuff, he didn't have great numbers, but barely ran any routes. Really ran very few routes. Got decent like targets per route. But it's interesting to compare him to somebody like a Scataboo, for example, who had these really huge receiving numbers, but ran way more routes because he's a 23-year-old compared to a 21. You're going to get a little bit of a difference there. The team treating Scataboo like the center of their offense relative to Sampson being this younger back who's now going pro at a younger age. If he was still in college 2 years from now, maybe he would get that type of deference. At the same time, maybe there are some concerns with his lack of receiving usage that he doesn't have that. We don't know. It's sort of an unknown or an unchecked box, but because of the really young age, I'm willing to give a little bit more of a pass that maybe that's just something that the team wasn't necessarily putting on his plate as much yet. It's nice to see the efficiency there. The evasion stuff is there, at these younger ages, and that he was able to do some things effectively. So he looks to me like maybe like a higher ceiling, but like wider range of outcomes type of player, right? Where we're so young, we still don't know. And then the other one I want to ask you about is Ollie Gordon, who you referenced. You seem to have some really favorable stuff about him in your write-up. He seems to be sliding. The way that I read what you wrote up is that, look, Oklahoma State cratered last year, and they went 3-9, and that doesn't help a running back. It's one of these situations where it's a tough spot for him to be in, but this is a bigger back, is 220 plus, like a big guy who has receiving numbers, who has this 3-down type of profile, and was really good when Oklahoma State was better in the earlier seasons, and then essentially got a little bit worse last year as it related to some of the efficiency stuff. Yards per carry is way down, but his evasion stuff, it gets worse, but it doesn't get way worse. And again, like the receiving, I mean, that like per route stuff isn't great. He ran a lot of routes. He looks like a true 3-down back. The receiving's not necessarily great, like yards per route run, that kind of stuff, but it looks fine to me, I guess. He's earning targets when he's out there. He's probably in the right place to be. He can catch some passes. The athleticism, again, for a bigger back is like okay, but it's not like strong or elite or anything. But I know you're a big production guy, and that 2023 season when Oklahoma State was a little better, had a better season, he has over 2,000 total yards. There's a lot to like here, and you wrote that up favorably prior to the 2024. Is this a guy, like, it reminds me a little like you talked about Chuba Hubbard this way, his final season, who also I think came out of Oklahoma State, right? His final season, he kind of backslides a little bit situational. Maybe for him it was a little more injury. The 2023 year at a younger age to have over 2,000 total yards seems pretty meaningful. The size and the receiving combination seems pretty meaningful. Is this another intriguing guy if he falls into round 3 in your rookie draft?
Well, the probably wildly misleading note I have at the end of Gordon's little profile here is that the other guy who was a 21-year-old rookie ran a 40 above 4.55 at the combine, weighed in at 230 at 6'1", runs for 1,700 yards, but at just 4.7 yards per carry, and catches 30 passes in each of his last 2 collegiate seasons, was Le'Veon Bell. I mean, Blair and I spent a lot of time noting that so many of the comparisons between Bell and Gordon are dead on, with the one very obvious difference being that Bell could point to having insane agility numbers for a back his size, which I don't think anybody is saying about Ollie Gordon. But it is interesting, that thing you note, which is that, again, when you're talking about a big back, and this is a big back, we tend to discount so many things if the class is weak, namely athleticism, but not discount those things if the class is strong. And we're talking about Gordon as a sophomore having the 1,700 rushing yards, not yards from scrimmage, but rushing yards that season. And this is a guy who, when you're looking at backs that year, he ranked 6th in routes, 5th in targets, 10th in yards, 8th in yards after contact, and with 10 additional evaded tackles as a receiver. That's all the receiving numbers on top of this player who was 1,700 rushing yards, big time rushing touchdown numbers that year. And then you look at the collapse, right? And one of the things that's interesting too, and this isn't to say people a year ago were necessarily wrong. They may not be wrong at that point compared to now. But if you look at all of the rankings for things a year ago, people were pretty high on Ollie Gordon. I think it's a little bit risky to come completely off of that if that's where you were a year ago with all of these other backs in this class, right? And one of the reasons I say that is that even though the yards per carry collapses, the yards after contact were the same. And so if you're someone who doesn't really believe in the yards before contact stuff, which is something I have pushed back on, to be clear, but that portion of it is the same. And a lot of what you're seeing is simply the vast differences in the quality of the rest of his team. The other thing that's weird that I can't really square, because it doesn't really seem possible, and so you wonder if there's just some charting issues, but SIS has his stuff rate actually being lower in his final season, even though his percentage of being hit at the line of scrimmage jumps from 41% to 48%. So I guess my point would be that if you do like Ollie Gordon, you probably still are justified in liking some of the elements that you originally liked. And there are at least some tiny breadcrumbs suggesting that his performance in 2024 wasn't really that bad when you adjust for the context. I think it's tricky when you look at all the guys that you can get in 2025 and say, why would I draft someone who's coming off a bad year and is not athletic? And that's probably the thing that is going to be the answer, right? Is why would you? But I mean, this is a player who could be in such free fall that at some point in your draft and in some point again in your seasonal leagues, you're saying, well, why would I not take a flyer on someone who just a year ago looked like the best running back in college football?
Yeah, it's so funny because you were just saying, just because the class is so good, we can't just completely ignore him for his red flags. But then you also kind of came to a conclusion of like, probably we should ignore him because of his red flags. There's too many other good backs in this class. It's hard not to, but it's that lesson. It's that reminder that what you're saying and what you did just say is a player with this profile can still hit in a meaningful way. We see it all the time. We see players with worse profiles hit. In your write-up of him, I think you mentioned the name Kyron Williams, who wasn't a bad prospect, but he wasn't like an elite prospect for any major reason. I'd scrolled past your profile of him, so I'm doing that off memory. You just wrote the similar thing about a final campaign that hurt Kyron Williams' status, sort of similar to the Chuba comparison I was drawing. Just another example of a player whose last year didn't necessarily tell the whole story of what he was. That's a guy who obviously has gone on to be a very, very good fantasy player. And then you look back and you're like, well, what should we have known about Kyron Williams? And you're like, well, I mean, there was red flags there too. There was concerns there too. That's why everyone wasn't completely in on him. It's a probabilistic thing. There's a range of outcomes element there. There are so many intriguing names here. We could do this forever. I know you mentioned Jarquez Hunter. You mentioned a few others. Is there any others that you mentioned Bashalt Smith? Is there any others that you really want to give a nod to before we wrap this up? I mean, there's a lot. I know, as you've said, much like Ollie Gordon, he's the one that I really wanted to grill you on. But all the ones that I had specific notes on, we've had a chance to go over. But I'm just wondering, are there other ones that are later that are really intriguing? Because there's a lot like Gordon that essentially could be productive. And that's, I think, one of the big parts of this rookie class is like, you want to draft these names that we've talked about on today's show, but you don't want to stop drafting them because you get other intriguing names that get pushed far down that may be day 3 picks that may wind up being very productive. They may be this year's Tyrone Tracy or Bucky Irving or Isaiah Pacheco from a few years back or whoever it is. Who are some others to think about in these later rounds?
Well, you mentioned Hunter there. I mean, this is a guy where like maybe he's not athletic enough for his size, and maybe the size means he just won't get enough total work. But this is a guy who led the SEC in yards per carry, averages 100 rushing yards per game, 4.1 yards after contact per attempt, 25% evasion rate, breaks 40 tackles, right? So again, a big broken tackle number that offsets the size, I think, in terms of how you think about him a little bit. He had a 50% positive percentage, the top first down rate among power conference backs, if you really believe that the first down element is important to you. Again, something that maybe offsets the size somewhat. And because of those different elements, his points above average per attempt were almost identical to Bijan Robinson's in 2022 and Bucky Irving's in 2023. So Ben, I mean, we are a huge number of players into this draft class, and like just mentioned the guy who led the SEC in yards per carry and has points above average numbers, which again, I think you want to look at that points above average number as an interesting fact, as opposed to be like, oh, this guy is the best. But when you're talking about similar to Bijan, similar to Bucky, it's just such a fun class. Rashard Smith is a guy who is a position change player. I don't really, this is one of the sort of weird things from, watching the combine and then seeing how the numbers come out. I don't know exactly how he accomplished this, but my understanding in terms of at least what the numbers that are logged officially are, that Rashard Smith had a 10-yard split that was slower than 7 tight ends. And he ran a 4.39 40 because he had a max speed of 23.3. So the thing I'm thinking here about him is that he probably is, I mean, the straight line speed is, again, just kind of pretty insane, right? The receiving numbers for him, and again, you kind of expect that as a receiver, but one of the things I kind of always throw out to you is that a lot of these position change guys had to change positions because they weren't actually that good as receivers. So it's really encouraging that Smith's receiving peripherals were fantastic last year. He is one of these guys who generated air yards. Again, maybe not surprising for a position change player, but you still like to see it. Good yards per route run. He catches those 39 passes for 327 yards, but he rushes for 1,300 yards. And I mean, this is the type of profile, again, where you have a Jamal Charles element to it, where you're looking at efficiency, you're looking at receiving, you're looking at long speed. When you watch him play, and again, some of the games and the highlights here are against lesser competition, but this is a guy where when he has the ball, you're like, there's just no angle. Right? You're not going to stop him. And similar to what we got from guys like Saquon and Jahmyr Gibbs, and I'm definitely not saying that Brashard Smith is going to be those guys, but when you break into the clear in the NFL and you think about what is being prioritized now, where NFL teams are finding it much more difficult to get explosives in the passing games. They're like, well, they're not even defending the run. Why don't we do that? Well, explosives in the run game matter. Brashard Smith looks like the type of athlete who could do that and may just be like barely scratching the surface of what he is.
More fun names to pay attention to. I'm looking at the efficiency stuff for those guys, particularly for Jarquez Hunter. Smith, you mentioned position change, doesn't have a ton of data there, but Jarquez Hunter looked really interesting. But then I'm also just brought back, Sean, to Ashton GD, who I just pulled in just sort of as a reference of like what the seal. I mean, the numbers are so high. They're even higher than Bucky Irving. Like they are just so, and that, I mean, on the missed tackles for stuff, but then the yards after contact stuff so funny. Like when we're talking about Ollie Gordon, we're talking about his 2,000 yards and his 1,700 rushing yards. And I was like, man, he had over 1,000 yards after contact, which is really good. And Scataboo had a season with 1,200, and GT had 1,970 last year. Had almost 2,000 yards after contact. It's just absurd. He's just his profile. I mean, the more you dig into the rest of the class, the more you, and how good a lot of these other profiles are, the more you can appreciate. I mean, I think the immediate thing is like when you hear about the Ashton Jeanty stuff, is like, is he the real deal? Is he that dude, or is he going to end up being Trent Richardson or whatever? And it's just like, this is why you keep saying he's the best prospect since probably Barry Sanders or Christian McCaffrey. These like true can't miss, just so good at football players. It's not the same as, Trent Richardson, for example, or a lot of these other scary cases. His profile is crazy.
Well, he had a season where he averaged well over 100 rushing yards per game, but also gained 569 receiving yards in just 12 games. Then he comes back the next year and they're like, why? I mean, do we need to pass it to him? Just hand him the ball. Averages almost 7 yards per carry. I mean, 2,600 rushing yards. Again, I would point out that you go back and look at some prospects, more than 5 years ago, and you're going to see some guys with some really gaudy numbers, some backs who put up huge totals. I mean, one of the things that I, would point out to people is that Chuba Hubbard, who I think is still looked a little bit at as a sleeper who made good. I mean, Chuba Hubbard had massive numbers in college, right? But what you're seeing here from GT, and one of the things too is kind of interesting that when you're trying to figure out like if some of the stuff is translating to the field. Now, again, the fly in the ointment on the max speed stuff for the in-game work always comes back to, well, did a guy break a long enough play that he could get up to max speed? But the funny thing, when you go back and look through who had all the top times from last year, is there are a lot of guys, a lot of interesting numbers, but it comes back to Ashton Jeanty has a huge number of the top times, in part because he's playing against a little bit lesser caliber of opponent, but also in part because he's consistently breaking into the clear, which matters. But Ben, you do love the fact that you have all of these numbers, but that also you have in the back of your mind, well, when this guy got into the open on a college football field, he could fly. And so you put that in as well. It's really pretty crazy. And certainly we're desperately hoping that this high-end outcome takes place, because the thing that makes fantasy fun, the thing that makes watching the NFL games fun on Sundays, are having dynamic playmakers. Watching these guys score 50 and 60-yard touchdowns is a blast.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's going to be – I can't wait for the draft now either. This has been such a fun conversation. I feel like I have such a better grasp on the running back class, which is really the meat of the fantasy class for this rookie class. I'm excited. I'm excited to see where these guys land, because this is going to be – there's a lot of interesting profiles we talked about today, and where they land is going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about Devin Neal, the KU guy. Ben, I didn't even get in there. 3 straight 1250-plus scrimmage yards, 20-plus TDs, double-digit TDs. I don't have him that high, but he's somebody else who goes high in a number of people's rankings. The consistency there. Rocket Sanders actually had the fastest running back time and is a big guy who catches passes, and yet people don't seem interested at all. I mean, that doesn't mean that they're wrong, but like, even as you go down and down and down, Damian Martinez, interesting. Taj Brooks, interesting. All the way through. So many guys that we love. This has been a lot of fun. Ben, we both have really good week coming up. You're going to be doing some family stuff. I'm going to be doing some family stuff. We hope that all of the listeners are also in a good place as they listen to Stealing Bananas early here in April. Spring has arrived. The world is beautiful. Ignore the outside stuff that maybe isn't as good. Maybe you go out there and see if you can talk for 25 hours straight. Ben, I don't know about you, but there was, for about 2 seconds, I was like, I wonder if Ben and I could do 25 hours during the NFL draft. But that has been this running back prospect version of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you head over to Stealing Signals, get yourself subscribed there. bengretch.substack.com. We'd love to have you guys at RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio2025 for 10% off your 1-year sub. The rookie guide is out, and we will have the 3rd edition after the NFL draft. We love y'all. We'll talk to you soon.